everyone, and welcome to Books in the World. We are delighted to come to you today with a couple of wonderful books by Nathaniel Philbrick. Hello, Nathaniel.
It's great to be here.
It's delightful to have you. I was telling you that this is the 40th anniversary of Books in the World. Books in the World has been going since 1978, and we are the oldest continuously running book talk show in the United States. So
there you go. Honored to be here.
It's a mouthful. Nathaniel has written a new book called Second Wind about a sunfish sailing racing on Nantucket, and also has another colonial history book called Valiant Ambition about George Washington and Benedict Arnold. So many people know you as the author of Mayflower and In the Heart of the Sea.
Right.
So they think of you as a historian.
Yes.
You are a historian. As a librarian, and I was telling you, we watch your books, we buy your books and we watch them go out, and then we buy the videos and then or the audio books, and we're very pleased that...
I love librarians, so it's great to be interviewed by one.
And we love authors like you as well, because we know just what we're going to have for book clubs and what we're going to recommend. It is great fun. So another one of your books that I recently listened to part of was Why Read Moby Dick?
Yes.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about that, if we don't mind the
for
sidebar.
me, why read Moby Dick? It's a question many kids have asked as seniors in high school.
Right.
And it's a very personal book, and probably the best thing about it is it's short, unlike Moby Dick. But Moby Dick has been my personal Bible since college, and it's a book I read at some parts at least every year. It's timeless for me, and so this is a book about why it, for my money, is the greatest American novel ever written. And it's also kind of a personal take on it, and so I talk about my life and how it relates to all that. And living on Nantucket, the port of the Pequod, having written In the Heart of the Sea, which is the real story upon which the climax of Moby Dick is based, and it being named for Nathaniel Hawthorne, to whom I was, for whom Moby Dick is dedicated. It just was a book I wanted to write. Well,
and not only do you offer your own insight, but I found in the parts that I listened to, it was like bringing all of American literature, all up to that point. It gives you a good starting point for understanding the American intellectual history at that point. So I'd recommend it.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's a nice take-in, and audiobooks are a great way to get into some of these things if you're not the type of person who can sit down and
Absolutely.
read them.
And in that book and in Second Wind, I read them, and which for me was with Why Read Moby Dick was a new experience, and it's great. I mean, my problem is I don't talk to anyone, so my voice runs out. But it's a real fun way for me to experience the book.
You don't talk to anyone because you're in libraries and stacks.
I'm writing just with my dog.
You're with your dog.
Yeah.
Well, when did you decide to have a full-time career as a writer?
I graduated from college, thought I was going to get a PhD in English. My father's now a retired English professor, and was at Duke University, and realized, no, I want to get out there. And so I had been a competitive sailor in college and got a job at a sailing magazine, and was there for 4 years. It's now Sailing World, based in Newport. And that's where I realized I want to write. And it wasn't until I moved to Nantucket with my wife, Melissa, and our 2 young children that I became fascinated with the history of Nantucket and really found my subject. And so I would research and write my first work of history, Away Offshore, which was written during the year I recount in Second Wind. And that set me on the path. Every other book has worked organically from each one. In the Heart of the Sea sprung from a chapter from Away Offshore, talking about George Pollard and the Essex. And so, I was an English major, so I had to sort of teach myself history.
I can't help but take a departure. Did you ever read the book Ahab's Wife?
Sure. Well, she was researching it while I was working on Away Offshore. So I got to, and it actually, I met her then, and then her book came out about the same time as In the Heart of the Sea.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
Another great take-in.
Yeah.
Ahab's Wife. I've forgotten
book.
the author's name. You may
Yeah.
remember it. But so you grew up in Pittsburgh, and you weren't really always around the sea, but you had gravitated in this direction.
Yeah. I grew up in Pittsburgh, the nautical center of the universe. But my grandparents had a place in West Falmouth on the Cape.
Okay.
And so that's where I learned how to sail in a Beetle Cat. And for me, it was the Garden of Eden. I just loved sailing. The sense of freedom and independence I got in a boat was something I just couldn't get anywhere else. And I was a very shy kid, and but secretly competitive. And eventually got a sunfish, and we would sail in Pittsburgh in a man-made lake about an hour outside the city, Moraine State Park, an old strip mine that had been flooded. And my brother had a boat, I had a boat, they had a small sunfish fleet, and that's really led me on the path of sailboat racing.
So you were living in Nantucket, and you decided that you wanted to train for a race. Can you get into the story of Second Wind a bit?
Well, we moved to Nantucket in '86, and I was a stay-at-home dad. And my wife, Melissa's job as attorney was what brought us to Nantucket. And, I launched into child care assuming there'd be a lot of stay-at-home dads like me, and no, there weren't,
In the 80s.
No, the 80s and 90s, but it was great to be with the kids, but, I was also trying to write. At that point, I was trying to write sailing articles, but if you've been at home with the kids, you lose about 20 IQ points, and just, my career was stalled, but everything was the family. And it was in the spring of '92, I was watching the America's Cup on ESPN in the afternoon of a week. The kids were at home, it was after school. And I hate the America's Cup because I'm a sunfish racer. We're talking primal sailing as opposed to billionaires squaring off. But here I was watching it, and it was time for the Mickey Mouse Club. And the kids say, hey, can we watch the Mickey Mouse Club? I said, no, I want to watch the America's Cup. And so my daughter says, get a life, and storms off. And I find them in the backyard throwing the Frisbee, and I go, maybe I should get a life. And I said, come here, look at my old sunfish was still leaning against the side of the house, and put it down, and it had the compassed headings from the Sunfish North Americans, the 78 Sunfish North Americans. 40 years ago, the same year this show started. Yeah. And I won that. I was the Sunfish North American champion. It was the highlight of my life. It's really been downhill ever since, but I hadn't...
In terms of sailing.
Right. But I hadn't been sailing, and I realized maybe what I need to get a life is to get back out on the race course. And so I figured out that the Sunfish North Americans, the next one, were going to be in Springfield, Illinois, on a lake, very similar to what I had sailed in Pittsburgh. But I lived on Nantucket with the highest, surrounded by ocean, with the highest wind velocities in the East Coast. How do you train for something in a windless inland lake? Well, the ponds. And so it's riddled with these beautiful little ponds. Some are round, some are long. And so I embarked on a training program in which I sailed a pond a weekend. And this was the year that I started writing Away Offshore, my first work of history. And so I used that as kind of a way to get to the places I was writing about in the book. It was,
That's nice.
And so it was a neat intersection. And, and I was pent up. This was truly a midlife crisis. I was ready to get going. So it was quite a year.
Describe the sunfish for people who might not be aware of what it's like.
Yeah, well, sunfish has been around forever. It's one of the most popular sailing classes in the world. And it's basically an ironing board, 13 and a half feet long, with a well for your feet, and has an isosceles triangle-shaped sail, a lateen rig. Very simple, but surprisingly fast. Very good performance. And because it weighs less than you do, your body weight can manipulate it in all sorts of ways, and it's the best boat possible for my money. It's you can buy them cheap. They're all over the country, used. They're like Twinkies. They last forever. And it's a one. If you're a kid, you can capsize in them and have fun. But if you're a sailing, an older person who wants to race, there's just a great class.
Now, once you started practicing or going out to do a pond a week, I think you said, you had some pretty harrowing adventures. It was for the real sailors who might be listening. Can you describe some of the challenges that you faced and how you overcame them?
Right. Well, this was in the winter in Nantucket, and and Nantucket is a very windy place, and we, just like last winter, we had a series of nor'easters come through where it's blowing in the 30s, if not more, and I was fairly rigorous in saying I'm going to sail a pond a week, and so. Some of these ponds are really small, and one of them, Head of Hummock, it's about 1/8 of a mile in diameter, and I sailed it in 22 degrees, blowing. So right, pretty much in the right there. That's Head of Hummock right there.
Okay.
And it was so cold that icicles were forming off the back of my life jacket, and sailing literally in circles, and it was good practice, but kind of insane, really.
There were other adventures you had going. They were cutting a divide in a pond so that they could drain some of the sludge that was in there.
Yeah, we had. It dates back to the Native Americans, but Nantucketers opened several of the ponds to the ocean. They make a cut, and in the fall and the spring, and the water just gushes out. Really, a white water river of pond water, and they were doing it in the spring of '93 while I was practicing, and I heard that they were doing it, and I thought, well, what it would be like to sail through the cut. And my wife Melissa and the kids were on the beach. My friend Bruce, who was the chairman of the conservation board, was there and saying, don't do it, don't do it. And and I was looking at it, and it was this river. It was amazing, and I said, I'm going to do it. And so I did it. It was really stupid because right at the mouth of it, where the ocean meets this rushing river of pond water, was this sandbar formed by waves from Portugal crashing on it. And so sailed right into the sandbar, which flipped up my rudder. I had to pull up my centerboard. My boat went sideways to the next wave, which capsized me, turtled me. I thought the rig had been torn out, and the water just blows me out about a quarter mile offshore. I right the boat. Luckily, the rig was still there, and I was able to sail back. But if it hadn't, I could have been in trouble. So that was one of those things. I look back, what the heck was I doing?
You were being a little foolish. That was before you got your winter wetsuit, or after?
Yes, I got a dry suit.
A dry suit,
luckily I had the dry suit. I think I was wearing the dry suit, but yeah, it was. I really didn't want to die doing this. But I clearly had issues I was working out.
So as the story goes on, you got a little discouraged by the weather, and you decided to go to Florida. Can you tell the story about that?
Yeah.
Not only the race, but do go into the race, but what it meant to you to go there, and what that was like for you personally.
Well, after a winter of solitary pond sailing, at the edge of the watery universe on Nantucket, I realized I've got to actually race somebody. Before I go to the North Americans, I need to have a wake-up call of some sort, and sort of see what the competition is. And the Sunfish, like many racing sailboat classes, has a midwinters every winter, usually in the Florida area. This was in Sarasota, so I went down, and there were 104 boats or something like that, which is a really big fleet. And it was kind of terrifying for me. Here I was, after 15 years out of the class to go down there, and there were a lot of people I already knew, which was fun, and a whole bunch of young hotshots. And it was a humbling return to competition, shall we say. I did not do very well, but it really helped inform me of what I needed to work on, and was a good first taste of what I had gotten myself into.
You had some comments about the kind of elitism of some of this. Some of the equipment was very posh, and
Yeah.
you were not feeling
Well,
like this isn't something that I think you craved to be, have the biggest and the best of everything. This
No, I
wasn't
didn't.
really you.
No, and I was doing this on a budget, and I really hadn't paid attention to the equipment because
Yeah.
I was using everything I was using was at least 15 years old because
Yeah,
that's the last time I had raced.
Yeah.
And so I go to the midwinters and realize, whoa, things have changed. They've really updated things. And so that was a startling wake-up call, and a good one, because I realized, okay, so I've got to get new equipment. And, so that began my process of getting realistic about this thing.
Yeah. Well, before we go on and discuss what eventually happened with your racing, unless you don't want to tell that part of the story and keep people in suspense, this is, I think this is after you came back and you were continuing to train, and it's about the feelings that you get being in the zone like an athlete,
Yeah.
I think.
Right. It's getting in the zone is something, all sports have, and it's getting to the point where you're not thinking about it, you're just doing it, and it's hard. And so this is a point, really the first point, where I began to feel like I was getting into that area. The boat began to feel like an extension of my body, a thing to be manipulated, not driven or hung on to. This was the feeling that had been missing all fall, a sense of the boat as an alive and ethereal being, the rudder and main sheets part of an interactive game with the sea and sky. D.H. Lawrence had described it. Beautifully, the sailing ship nodalizes the forces of sea and wind, converting them to her purpose. There is no violation, only a winged centrality. It is this perfect equipoise between them and us which gives us a great part of our life joy. Lawrence clearly knew the zone. Sailors have a word to describe the sensitivity required to achieve this perfect equipoise. It's called feel, and to a certain extent, either you have it or you don't. I've seen professional baseball player, a superb athlete with absolutely no feel, become so disoriented during a routine day sail that he slipped and fell out of a boat. I've seen a 58-year-old woman with a bad hip step into the same sailboat that gave the baseball player such trouble and be immediately at home. Instead of unnerving her, the unsteadiness of the water and the flukiness of the breeze liberated her from the cruel grasp of dry land and gravity that forced her to walk with a cane. She intuitively understood and was delighted by the way sailing reinvented the playing field. The athlete, on the other hand, wanted no part of it. More than anything else, feel is a matter of empathy with the wind and water. Whereas most sports deny nature altogether, a sailor cannot escape it. As long as the wind fills the sails, he or she is consorting with a force beyond human control. But feel doesn't emanate from a higher spiritual plane. On the contrary, it is primitive, elemental. Feel reaches back into the marrow and the synapses, into the brine of the bloodstream. Everything is reduced to instinct. As I sail, I'm a throwback to an earlier evolutionary stage. I am very like a seal, because I was sailing with the seals off Jetty's Beach at this point. On that December afternoon, as I sailed around Brant Point, I owed the seals a debt of gratitude. With their help, I had begun to feel once again like a sailor.
Thank you very much. I listened to that, and I can only say no wonder you're considered such a great writer, because I think you have a very easy way of expressing a lot.
Well, thank you.
A lot of imagery that's just great. This is something that you've talked about in your book. How have bodies of water influenced you? This is, to me, the bottom line of this little journey that you went on, that you talked a lot about your relationship to the water.
Yeah, the water, and it's odd because I did grow up in Pittsburgh, but, Pittsburgh is the three rivers, it's three rivers. And rivers are also an important part of, it's water defines really my approach to sort of the world and also to history. Every one of my books, even The Last Stand about the Battle of Little Bighorn, has a watery thread running through it. And yeah, for me, it is primal, and it is the wilderness that America had before there was the interior of this country. And it kind of defines civilization, and for my money, is really determines kind of what our national identity was in the beginning. You know, Mayflower, for me, that book was an attempt to sort of approach what that sea journey was, and then the fact that the Plymouth colony was a coastal community, and the sea had so much in defining it. So yeah, it's pretty much, I can't think of myself being anywhere without some way of getting to the water.
Getting to the water. Well, with that, I want to encourage people to pick up this book, though, people can enjoy that. And getting back to American history,
yes.
We're taking a little departure. I'm going to talk briefly about Valiant Ambition, about the American Revolution, and as you were talking about the sea, I was thinking about asking you the next question, and right away I'm thinking about the Hudson River and where the British were and where George Washington was and Brooklyn Heights. And there's another story about the water that opens up this book.
Absolutely, yeah.
The subtitle is George Washington, Benedict Arnold, and
The Fate of the American Revolution.
Fate of the American Revolution.
Yeah.
Give us a little synopsis of what was going on here.
Right. Well, my previous book had been Bunker Hill, about the beginning of the Revolution, and I never really saw myself writing another book about the Revolution, but I became so fascinated with George Washington, who is really a walk-in character in Bunker Hill because he appears after that great battle. And this was not the George Washington of the $1 bill. This was a red-haired guy in his early 40s, fiery, aggressive, you know, not yet the staid, conservative strategist that he would become. And I realized I want to find out what happens to him. So I knew I wanted to follow him, but I also wanted to pair him with someone else because, you know, I'm not a military historian. I'm interested in the people and its character. All my books are about leadership, one way or another. And my mother was a contrarian from the beginning, and her personal hero was Benedict Arnold. And I always said, you know, Mom, what the heck are you talking about? Benedict Arnold, the hero? I mean, to be called a Benedict Arnold is to be called, you know, to be evil personified. And she said, no, there was more to the story. And so I began to look into Benedict Arnold, and Mom was absolutely right. And I realized that Washington and Arnold had an important relationship. Arnold was his best general, and he was personally bludgeoned by the realization that Arnold had betrayed him. And so this book traces their relationship with Washington, the man fated to hold this country together, at his absolute lowest when he loses New York in the Battle of Long Island, and Arnold at his highest when he wins, when he has an incredible performance at the Battle of Valcour Island at Lake Champlain, that prevents Britain from taking control of the Hudson and winning the Revolution in 1776. And so it begins with Arnold, the person who decides it's his job to pull this country apart ultimately at his highest. And we watch what happens over the course of the next 4 years, with the story climaxing with Arnold's decision to betray his country and surrender West Point to the British.
Both stories are really interesting, and you mentioned that there was a kind of revisionist historian at the time about George Washington. You mentioned this right in the beginning of your book, but his work was destroyed. That there really isn't that other point of view that's documented.
Yeah, it's tough with Washington. You know, Charles Thompson, he was the Secretary of the Continental Congress, and he was there throughout the entire history of the Continental Congress. So as delegates and so officials came and went, he was always there. And late in life, he decided he was going to write his understanding of what happened in the Revolution. Everyone said, do it. No one knew it better. And by the time he was doing this, there was the history of the Revolution was being written and it was unlike anything he experienced. It was it was a group of heroes, launching this country on the path to greatness, and what he witnessed was nothing like that. And so he ended up destroying his manuscript rather than trying to buck the trend. And when it comes to Washington, his letters to Martha, which would have been the letters where he really revealed his true feelings, were all burned by Martha after his death. And so, Washington remains an enigma, and yet he is absolutely the central figure. I mean, I don't have many heroes in my life. I grew up in the 60s, I'm kind of cynical, but Washington, my goodness, I mean, what he was able to accomplish, his tremendous ability to learn under pressure, to change. Most of us can't change. We are who we are. He consciously would reinvent himself in a way to do things better. And so, so I found it a fascinating book to work on.
So as a librarian, I have to ask you, who would you read if you wanted to read more about George Washington and Benedict Arnold? Yeah,
well, there's a whole group of books. In fact, there's 2 new books about Benedict Arnold that are coming out this May, and which I haven't read them, but I would recommend them. When it comes to Washington, there's a great Ron Chernow biography, but there's just tons of stuff. And for me, the great challenge of writing a book like that is reading all that and then coming up with what you think is what is he was actually like. And to do that, you have to go to the archives. You have to go to the letters. He also kept a diary during many of these times, and really get a view of it.
I should mention that our Cape Cod Writers Center president, our executive director, wrote a book about Benedict Arnold's wife and Robert Knox's wife.
A great book about Peggy.
Yeah. Peggy Shippen.
Yes.
Very interesting. So, well, I could go on and on. I'd like to ask you more about memoir writing, more about how you do historical research, but we did cover some of that. Time has come to the end. Thank you so much. So we appreciate having you in this, our 40th year.
Well, it's great to be with you guys again, and may you have another 40.
Oh, that would be wonderful. And people should go to their local bookstores and libraries. I always say that. If you're not buying books, do go to the libraries. The libraries will buy them. And thanks again for coming, and good luck with all your talks, and I'm sure people will totally enjoy hearing more about this book.
Well, thank you. It's been a great pleasure.
Thanks for coming.